Chapter 1 of Kitchener's Mob by James Norman Hall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Venditti, MikeVenditti.com. Kitchener's Mob by James Norman Hall. Chapter 1. Note: this brief narrative is by no means a complete record of life in a battalion in one of Lord Kitchener's first armies. It is rather a story in outline, a mere suggestion of that life that is lived in the British lines along the Western Front. If those who read gain thereby a more intimate view of trench warfare and the men who are so gallantly and cheerfully laying down their lives for England, the purpose of the writer will have been accomplished. Kitchener's Mob, Chapter 1. Joining Up. Kitchener's Mob, they were called in the early days of August 1914, when London hoardings were clamorous with the first calls for volunteers. The seasoned regulars of the 1st British Expeditionary Force said it patronizingly, the great British public hopefully, the world at large doubtfully. Kitchener's Mob, when there was but a scant 60,000 under arms, with millions yet to come. Kitchener's Mob. It remains today, fighting in hundreds of thousands in France, Belgium, Africa, the Balkans. And tomorrow, when the war is ended, who will come marching home again? Old campaigners, war-worn remnants of once mighty armies. Kitchener's Mob. It is not a pleasing name for the greatest volunteer army in the history of the world. For more than 3 millions of toughened, disciplined fighting men, united under one flag, all parts of one magnificent military organization. And yet, Kitchener's own Tommies are responsible for it. The rank and file, with their inherent love of ridicule even at their own expense, and their intense dislike of swank, they fastened the name upon themselves, lest the world at large should think they regarded themselves too highly. There it hangs. There it will hang for all time. It was on the 18th of August, 1914, that the mob spirit gained its mastery over me. After 3 weeks of solitary tramping in the mountains of North Wales, I walked suddenly into news of the Great War, and went at once to London with a longing for home, which seemed strong enough to carry me through the week of idleness until my boat should sail. But in a spirit of adventure, I suppose, I tempted myself with the possibility of assuming the increasingly popular alias Atkins. On 2 successive mornings I joined the long line of prospective recruits before the officers at Great Scotland Yard, withdrawing each time, after moving a convenient distance towards the desk of the recruiting sergeant. Disregarding the proven fatality of third times, I joined it on another morning, dangerously near the head of the procession. "Now then, you, step along." There is something compelling about a military command, given by a military officer accustomed to being obeyed. While the doctors were thumping me, measuring me, and making an inventory of physical peculiarities, if any, I tried to analyze my unhesitating, almost instinctive reaction to that stern, confident, "Step along." Was it an act of weakness, a want of character, evidenced by my inability to say no? Or was it the blood of military forebears, asserting itself after many years of inanition? The latter conclusion being the more pleasing, I decided that I was the grandson of my Civil War grandfather, and the worthy descendant of stalwart warriors of a yet earlier period. I was frank with the recruiting officers. I admitted, rather boasted of my American citizenship, but expressed my entire willingness to serve in the British Army in case this should not expatriate me. I had, in fact, delayed, hoping that an American Legion would be formed in London, as had been done in Paris. The announcement was received with some surprise. A brief conference was held, during which there was much vigorous shaking of heads. While I awaited the decision, I thought of the steamship ticket in my pocket. I remembered that my boat was to sail on Friday. I thought of my plans for the future, and anticipated joy of an early homecoming. Set against this was the prospect of an indefinite period of soldiering among strangers. 3 years, or the duration of the war, were the terms of the enlistment contract. I had visions of bloody engagements, of feverish nights in hospital, of endless years in a home for disabled soldiers. The conference was over, and the recruiting officer returned to his desk, smiling broadly. "We'll take you, my lad, if If you want to join, you'll just say you are an Englishman, won't you, as a matter of formality?" Here was an avenue of escape beckoning me like an alluring country road winding over the hills of home. I refused it with the same instinctive swiftness of decision that had brought me to the medical inspection room. And a few moments later I took the King's shilling, and promised upon my oath as a loyal British subject to bear true allegiance to the Union Jack. During the completion of other less important formalities, I was taken in charge by a sergeant who might have stepped out of any the barrack room ballad. He was true to type to the last twist in S of Atkins. He told me of service in India, Egypt, South Africa. He showed me both scars and medals with an air of, "I wouldn't do this for any one but you," which is so flattering to the novice. He gave me advice as to my best method of procedure when I should go to Hounslow Barracks to join my unit. "And 'ere, whatever you do and whatever you say, don't forget to make the lads think you're an out-and-outer. If you understand my meaning, a Britisher, you know. They'll take to you, strike me blind. Be free and easy with 'em. No swank, mind you, and they'll be downright pals with you. You're different, you know, but don't put on no airs. What I mean is, don't let 'em think you're different. See what I mean?" I said that I did. "And another thing, talk like 'em." I confessed that this might prove to be a rather large contract. "I'd say if I'd have for a day, I'd have you talking like a born Londoner. All you gotter do is forget all them H's, and you don't want to say can't. Say that. Say quan't." I said it. "Now say gorblimey, how's the missus?" I did. "That's right. Oh, you'll get the swing of it." There was much more instruction of the same nature. By the time I was ready to leave the recruiting offices, I felt I had made great progress in the vernacular. I said good-bye to the sergeant warmly. As I was about to leave, he made the most peculiar and amusing gesture of a man drinking. "A pint o' mild to bitter," he said confidently. "The boys always give me the price of a pint." "Right you are, Sergeant." I used the expression like a born Englishman, and with the liberty of a true soldier I gave him my shilling, my first day's wages as a British fighting man. The remainder of the week I spent mingling with the crowds of enlisted men at the Horse Guards Parade, watching the bulletin boards for the appearance of my name, which would mean that I was to report to the regimental depot in Hounslow. My first impression of the men with whom I was to live for 3 years or the duration of the war was anything but favorable. The newspapers had been asserting that the new army was being recruited from the flower of England's young manhood. The throng at the Horse Guard Parade resembled an army of unemployed, and I thought it likely that most of them were misfits, out of works, the kind of men who join the army because they can do nothing else. There were, in fact, a good many of these. I soon learned, however, that the general out-at-elbows appearance was due to another cause. A genial cockney gave me the hint. "Have you joined up, mate?" he asked. I told him that I had. "Well, here's a friendly tip for you. Don't wear them good clothes when you goes to the depot. You won't see 'em again likely, and if you gets through the war you might be a-wantin' of 'em. Wear the worst rags you got." I profited by the advice, and when I fell in with the other recruits for the Royal Fusiliers, I felt much more at my ease. End of Chapter 1. Of Kitchener's Mob by James Norman Hall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Kitchener's Mob by James Norman Hall. Chapter 2. Rookies. A mob is genuinely descriptive of the array of would-be soldiers which crowded the long parade ground at Hounslow Barracks during that memorable week in August. We herded together like so many sheep. We had lost our individuality, and it was to be months before we regained it in a new aspect, a collective individuality, of which we became increasingly proud. We squeak-squawked across the barrack square in boots which felt large enough for an entire family of feet. Our khaki service-dress uniforms were strange and uncomfortable. Our hands hung limply along the seams of our pocketless trousers, having no place in which to conceal them and nothing for them to do. We tried to ignore them. Many a Tommy, in a moment of forgetfulness, would make a dive for the friendly pockets which were no longer there. The look of sheepish disappointment, as his hand slid limply down his trouser leg, was most comical to see. Before many days we learned the uses to which soldiers' hands were put, but for the moment they seemed absurdly unnecessary. We must have been unpromising material from the military point of view. That was evidently the opinion of my own platoon sergeant. I remember word for word his address of welcome, one of soldier-like brevity and pointedness, delivered while we stood awkwardly at attention on the barrack square. "Listen here, you men. I've never seen such a raw, round-shouldered batch of rookies in 15 years' service. You're pasty-faced, and you're thin-chested. God help His Majesty, if it ever lays with you to save him. However, we're 'ere to do what we can with what we got. Now then, upon the command, form fours. I want to see the even numbers. Take pace to the rear with the left foot, and one to the right with the right foot, like so. 1, 1, 2. Platoon, form fours. Oh, awful as ye are as ye were." If there was doubt in the minds of any of us as to our rawness, it was quickly dispelled by our platoon sergeants, regulars of long standing, who had been left in England to assist in whipping the new armies into shape. Naturally, they were disgruntled at this, and we offered them such splendid opportunities for working off overcharges of spleen. We had come to Hounslow believing that within a few weeks' time we should be fighting in France, side by side with the men of the 1st British Expeditionary Force. Lord Kitchener had said that 6 months of training at the least was essential. This statement we regarded as intentionally misleading. Lord Kitchener was too shrewd a soldier to announce his plans, but England needed men badly, immediately. After a week of training we should be proficient in the use of our rifles. In addition to this, all that was needed was the ability to form fours and march in column of route to the station where we should entrain for Folkestone or Southampton and France. As soon as the battalion was up to strength, we were given a day of preliminary drill before proceeding to our future training area in Essex. It was a disillusioning experience. Equally disappointing was the undignified display of our little skill at Charing Cross Station, where we performed before a large and amused London audience. For my own part, I could scarcely wait until we were safely hidden within the train. During the journey to Colchester, a re-enlisted Boer War veteran, from the inaccessible heights of South African experience, enfiladed us with a fire of sarcastic comment. "I'm a-goin' to transfer out of this 'ere mob. It's what I'm a-goin' to do. Soldiers say, I'd bet a quid ain't a one of you ever saw a rifle before. Soldiers, strike me pink. What's kind of Lord Kitchener a-doin'? That's what I don't know." The rest of us smoked in wrathful silence until one of the boys demonstrated to the Boer War veteran that he knew, at least, how to use his fists. There was some bloodshed, followed by reluctant apologies on the part of the Boer warrior. It was one of innumerable differences of opinion which I witnessed during the months that followed, and most of them were settled in the same decisive way. Although mine was a London regiment, we had men in the ranks from all parts of the United Kingdom. There were North countrymen, a few Welsh, Scotch, and Irish, men from the Midlands and from the south of England, but for the most part we were Cockneys, born within the sound of Bow bells. I had planned to follow the friendly advice of the recruiting sergeant. "Talk like 'em," he had said. Therefore I struggled bravely with the peculiarities of the Cockney twang, recklessly dropped H's when I should have kept them, and prefixed them indiscriminately before every convenient aspirate. But all my efforts were useless. The impression was apparent to my fellow Tommies immediately. I had only to begin speaking within the hearing of a genuine Cockney, when he would say, "Hello! Where do you come from? The States?" Or, "A bit of tanner you're a Yank." I decided to make a confession, and have been glad ever since that I did. The boys gave me a warm and hearty welcome when they learned that I was a sure enough American. They called me Jamie the Yank. I was a piece of tangible evidence of the bond of sympathy existing between the two great English-speaking nations. I told them of the many Americans of German extraction whose sympathies were honestly and sincerely on the other side, but they would not have it so. I was the personal representative of the American people. My presence in the British Army was proof positive of this. Being an American, it was very hard at first to understand the class distinctions of British Army life, and having understood them, it was more difficult yet to endure them. I learned that a ranker, or private soldier, is a socially inferior being from the officer's point of view. The officer class and ranker class are east and west, and never the twain shall meet, except in their respective places upon the parade ground. This does not hold good to the same extent upon active service. Hardships and dangers shared in common tend to break down artificial barriers. But even then, although there was good-will and friendliness between officers and men, I saw nothing of genuine comradeship. This seemed to me a great pity. It was a loss for the officers fully as much as it was for the men. I had to accept for convenience sake the fact of my social inferiority. Centuries of army tradition demanded it, and I discovered that it was absolutely futile for one inconsequential American to rebel against the unshakable fortresses of English tradition. Nearly all of my comrades were used to clear-cut class distinctions in civilian life. It made little difference to them that some of our officers were recruits as raw as were we ourselves. They had money enough and education enough and influence enough to secure the King's commission, and that fact was proof enough for Tommy that they were gentlemen, and therefore too good for the likes of him to be associating with. "Look here, ain't a gentleman a gentleman? I'm asking you, ain't he?" I saw the futility of discussing this question with Tommy, and later I realized how important for British Army discipline such distinctions are. So great is the force of prevailing opinion that I sometimes found myself accepting Tommy's point of view. I wondered if I was, for some eugenic reason, the inferior of these men whom I had to "sir" and salute whenever I dared speak. Such lapses were only occasional, but I understood, for the first time, how important a part circumstance and environment play in shaping one's mental attitude. Now I longed at times to chat with colonels and joke with captains on terms of equality. Whenever I confided these aspirations to Tommy, he gazed at me in awe. "Don't be a bloomin' idiot! They could jolly well hang you for that." End of chapter 2. Kitchener's Mob by James Norman Hall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Kitchener's Mob by James Norman Hall. Chapter 3. The Mob in Training. The Nth Service Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, on the march was a sight not easily to be forgotten. To the inhabitants of Colchester, Folkestone, Shorncliffe, Aldershot, and other towns and villages throughout the south of England, we were well known. We displayed ourselves with what must have seemed to them a shameless disregard for appearances. Our approach was announced by a discordant tumult of fifes and drums, for our band, of which we became later justly proud, was a newly fledged and still imperfect organization. Windows were flung up and doors thrown open along our line of march. But alas, we were greeted with no welcome glances of kindly approval, no waving of handkerchiefs, no clapping of hands. Nursemaids, who are said to have a nice and discriminating eye for soldiery, gazed in amused and contemptuous silence as we passed. Children looked at us in wide-eyed wonder. Only the dumb beasts were demonstrative, and they in a manner which was not at all to our liking. Dogs barked, and sedate old family horses, which would stand placidly at the curbing while fire engines thundered past with bells clanging and sirens shrieking, pricked up their ears at our approach, and, after one startled glance, galloped madly away and disappeared in clouds of dust far in the distance. We knew why the nursemaids were cool, and why family horses developed hysteria with such startling suddenness, but in our pride we did not see that which we did not wish to see. Therefore we marched, or, to be more truthful, shambled on, shouting lusty choruses with an air of boisterous gaiety which was anything but genuine. "You do as I do, and you'll do all right. Fall in and follow me," was a favorite with No. 12 Platoon. Their enthusiasm might have carried conviction had it not been for their personal appearance, which certainly did not. No. 15 Platoon would strive manfully for a hearing with "steadily, shoulder to shoulder, steadily, blade by blade, marching along, sturdy and strong, like the boys of the old brigade." As a strictly accurate historian, I must confess that none of these assertions were quite true. We marched neither steadily, nor shoulder to shoulder, nor blade by blade. We staggered all over the road, and kept step only with the sergeant major doubling forward, warning us, with threats of extra drills, to keep in our fours and pick it up. In fact, the boys of the old brigade, whoever they may have been, would have scornfully repudiated any suggestion that we resembled them in any respect. They would have been justified in doing so had any of them seen us at the end of 6 weeks of training, for however reluctantly we were forced to admit that Sergeant Harris was right when he called us a raw bunch of rookies. Unpromising we were not. There was good stuff in the ranks, the material from which real soldiers are made, and were made, but it had not yet been rounded into shape. We were still nothing more than a homogeneous assembly of individuals. We declined to accept the responsibility for the seeming slowness of our progress. We threw it unhesitatingly upon the War Office, which had not equipped us in a manner befitting our new station in life. Although we were recruited immediately after the outbreak of war, less than half of our number had been provided with uniforms. Many still wore old civilian clothing. Others were dressed in canvas fatigue suits, or the worn-out uniforms of policemen and tramcar conductors. Every old clothes shop on Petticoat Lane must have contributed its allotment of cast-off apparel. Our arms and equipment were of an equally nondescript character. We might easily have been mistaken for a mob of vagrants which had pillaged a 17th-century arsenal. With a few slight changes in costuming for the sake of historical fidelity, we would have served as a citizen army for a realistic motion-picture drama depicting an episode in the French Revolution. We derived what comfort we could from the knowledge that we were but one of many battalions of Kitchener's first 100,000 equipped in the same makeshift fashion. We did not need the repeated assurances of cabinet ministers that England was not prepared for war. We were in a position to know that she was not. Otherwise there had been an unpardonable lack of foresight in high places. Supplies came in driblets. Each night, when parades for the day were over, there was a rush for the orderly room bulletin board, which was scanned eagerly for news of an early issue of clothing. As likely as not, we were disappointed, but occasionally jaded hopes arrived. No. 15 Platoon will parade at 4 p.m. on Thursday the 24th for boots, puttees, braces, and service dress caps. No. 15 is our platoon. Promptly at the hour set, we halt and right turn in front of the quartermaster's store's marquee. The quartermaster is there with pencil and notebook, and immediately takes charge of the proceedings. "All men needing boots, 1 pace, step forward. March!" The platoon, 65 strong, steps forward as one man. "All men needing braces, 1 step back. March!" Again we move as a unit. The quartermaster hesitates for a moment, but he is a resourceful man and has been through this many times before. We all need boots, quite right. But the question is, who need them most? Undoubtedly those whose feet are most in evidence through worn soles and tattered uppers. Adapting this sight test, he eliminates more than half the platoon, whereupon, by a further process of elimination, due to the fact that he has only sizes 7 and 8, he selects the fortunate 12 who are to walk dry-shod. The same method of procedure is carried out in selecting the braces. Private Reynolds, whose trousers are held in place by a wonderful mechanism composed of shoelaces and bits of string, receives a pair. Likewise, Private Stepanos, who, with the aid of safety pins, has fashioned coat and trousers into an ingenious one-piece garment. Caps and puttees are distributed with like impartiality, and we dismiss the unfortunate ones growling and grumbling in discreet undertones until the platoon commander is out of hearing, whereupon the murmurs of discontent become loudly articulate. "Kitchener's ragtime army, I calls it," growls the veteran of South African fame. "Ain't we an handsome lot o' posy wallopers? Service? We ain't never a-goin' to see service. You blokes won't but watch me. I'm a-goin' to grease off out o' this mob." No one remonstrated with this deservedly unpopular reservist when he grumbled about the shortage of supplies. He voiced the general sentiment. We all felt that we would like to grease off out of it. Our deficiencies in clothing and equipment were met by the government with what seemed to us amazing slowness. However, Tommy is a sensible man. He realized that England had a big contract to fulfill, and that the first duty was to provide for the armies in the field. France, Russia, Belgium, all were looking to England for supplies. Kitchener's mob must wait, trusting to the genius for organization, the faculty for getting things done, of its great and worthy chief, K. of K. Our housing accommodations throughout the autumn and winter of 1914 through 1915, when England was in such urgent need of shelter for her rapidly increasing army, were also of the makeshift order. We slept in leaky tents or in hastily constructed wooden shelters, many of which were afterward condemned by the medical inspectors. St. Martin's Plain, Shorncliffe, was an ideal camping site for pleasant summer weather, but when the autumnal rains set in, the green pasture land became a quagmire. Mud was the great reality of our lives, the malignant deity which we fell down in and propitiated with profane rites. It was a thin, watery mud, or a thick, viscous mud, as the steady downpour increased or diminished. Late in November we were moved to a city of wooden huts at Sandling Junction to make room for newly recruited units. The dwellings were but half finished, the drains were open ditches, and the rains descended and the floods came as usual. We lived an amphibious and wretched existence until January, when, to our great joy, we were transferred to billets in the Metropole, one of Folkestone's most fashionable hotels. To be sure, we slept on bare floors, but the roof was rainproof, which was the essential thing. And aesthetically inclined could lie in their blankets at night, gazing at richly gilded mirrors over the mantelpieces and beautifully frescoed ceilings, refurnishing our apartments in all their former splendor. Private Henry Morgan was not of this type. Henry came in one evening, rather the worse for liquor, and with clubbed musket assaulted his unlovely reflection in the expensive mirror. I believe he is still paying for his lack of restraint at the rate of 6 pence per day, and will have cancelled his obligation by January 1921, if the war continues until that time. Although we were poorly equipped and sometimes wretchedly housed, the commissariat was excellent and on the most generous scale from the very beginning. Indeed, there was nearly as much food wasted as eaten. Naturally, the men made no complaint, although they regretted seeing such quantities of food thrown daily into the refuse barrels. I often felt that something should be done about it. Many exposés were, in fact, written from all parts of England. It was irritating to read of German efficiency in the presence of England's extravagant and unbusinesslike methods. Tommy would say, "Lor' lumme, ain't we got no pigs in England? That there food won't be wasted. We'll be eatin' it in sausages when we gets across the Channel." Whereupon he dismissed the whole question from his mind. This seemed to me then the typical Anglo-Saxon attitude. Everywhere there was waste, muddle-headedness, and apparently it was nobody's business, nobody's concern. Camps were sited in the wrong places and buildings erected only to be condemned. Tons of food were purchased overseas, transported across thousands of miles of ocean, only to be thrown into refuse barrels. The government was robbed by avaricious hotel keepers who made and were granted absurd claims for damages done to their property by billeted troops. But with vast new armies recruited overnight, it was not strange that there should be mismanagement and friction at first. As the months passed, there was a marked change for the better. British efficiency asserted itself. This was made evident to us in scores of ways. The distribution of supplies, the housing and equipping of troops, their movements from one training area to another. At the last, we could only marvel that a great and complicated military machine had been so admirably and quickly perfected. Meanwhile, our rigorous training continued from week to week in all weathers, even the most inclement. Reveille sounded at daybreak. For an hour before breakfast we did Swedish drill, a system of gymnastics which brought every lazy and disused muscle into play. 2 hours daily were given to musketry practice. We were instructed in the description and recognition of targets, the use of cover, but chiefly in the use of our rifles. Through constant handling they became a part of us, a third arm which we grew to use quite instinctively. We fired the recruits and later the trained soldiers' course in musketry on the rifle ranges, at Hythe and Aldershot, gradually improving our technique until we were able to fire with some accuracy 15 rounds per minute. When we had achieved this difficult feat, we ceased to be recruits. We were skilled soldiers of the proud and illustrious order known as England's Mad Minute Men. After musketry practice, the remainder of the day was given to extended order, company and battalion drill. Twice weekly we route marched from 10 to 15 miles, and at night, after the parades for the day were finished, boxing and wrestling contests, arranged and encouraged by our officers, kept the red blood flowing through our bodies until lights out sounded at 9 o'clock. The character of our training changed as we progressed. We were done with squad, platoon, and company drill. Then came field maneuvers, attacks in open formation upon entrenched positions, finishing always with terrific bayonet charges. There were mimic battles lasting all day, with from 10 to 20,000 men on each side, artillery, infantry, cavalry, aircraft, every branch of army service, in fact, had a share in these exciting field days, when we gained bloodless victories or died painless and easy deaths at the command of red-capped field judges. We rushed boldly to the charge, shouting lustily, each man striving to be first at the enemy's position, only to be intercepted by a staff officer on horseback, staying the tide of battle with uplifted hand. "March your men back, officer. You're out of action. My word, you've made a beastly mess of it. You're not on church parade, you know. You advanced across the open for 3/4 of a mile in close column of platoons. 3 batteries of field artillery and 4 machine guns have blown you to blazes. You haven't a man left." Sometimes we reached our objective with less fearful slaughter, but at the moment when there should have been the sharp clash and clang of steel on steel, the cries and groans of men fighting for their lives, we heard the bugles from far and near, sounding the stand-by, and friend and enemy dropped warily to the ground for a rest while our officers assembled in conference around the motor of the divisional general. All this was playing at war, and Tommy was fed up with play. As we marched back to barracks after a long day of monotonous field maneuvers, he eased his mind by making sarcastic comments upon this inconclusive kind of warfare. He began to doubt the good faith of the War Office in calling ours a service battalion. As likely as not, we were for home defense and would never be sent abroad. Left, right, why did I join the army? Oh, why did I ever join Kitchener's mob? Oh, lummy, let's ever been blommy, became the favorite homeward-bound marching song. And so he groused and grumbled after the manner of Tommies the world over, and in the meantime he was daily approaching more nearly the standard of efficiency set by England's inexorable warlord. It was interesting to note the physical improvement in the men wrought by a life of healthy, well-ordered routine. My battalion was recruited largely from what is known in England as the lower middle classes. There were shop assistants, clerks, railway and city employees, tradesmen, and a generous sprinkling of common laborers. Many of them had been used to indoor life, practically all of them to city life, and needed months of the hardest kind of training before they could be made physically fit, before they could be seasoned and toughened to withstand the hardships of active service. Plenty of hard work in the open air brought great and welcome changes. The men talked of their food and anticipated it with a zest which came from realizing, for the first time, the joy of being genuinely hungry. They watched their muscles harden with the satisfaction known to every normal man when he is becoming physically efficient. Food, exercise, and rest taken in wholesome quantities and at regular intervals were having the usual excellent results. For my own part, I had never before been in such splendid health. I wished that it might at all times be possible for democracies to exercise a beneficent paternalism over the lives of their citizenry, at least in matters of health. It seems a great pity that the principle of personal freedom should be responsible for so many ill-shaped and ill-sorted physical incompetents. My fellow Tommies were living, really living, for the first time. They had never before known what it means to be radiantly, buoyantly healthy. There were, as well, more profound and subtle changes in thoughts and habits. The restraints of discipline and the very exacting character of military life and training gave them self-control, mental alertness. At the beginning they were individuals, no more cohesive than so many grains of wet sand. After 9 months of training they acted as a unit, obeying orders with that instinctive promptness of action which is so essential on the field of battle, when men think scarcely at all. But it is true that what was their gain as soldiers was, to a certain extent, their loss as individuals. When we went on active service, I noted that men who were excellent followers were not infrequently lost when called upon for independent action. They had not been trained to take the initiative, and had become so accustomed to having their thinking done for them that they often became confused and excited when they had to do it for themselves. Discipline was an all-important factor in the daily grind. At the beginning of their training, the men of the new armies were generally dealt with. Allowances were made for civilian frailties and shortcomings. But as they adapted themselves to changed conditions, restrictions became increasingly severe. Old privileges disappeared one by one. Individual liberty became a thing of the past. The men resented this bitterly for a time. Fierce hatred of officers and NCOs were engendered, and there was much talk of revenge when we should get to the front. I used to look forward with misgiving to that day. It seemed probable that one night in the trenches would suffice for a wholesale slaughtering of officers. Old scores were to be paid off, old grudges wiped out with our first issue of ball ammunition. Many a fist-banged board at the wet canteen gave proof of Tommy's earnestness. "Shoot him?" he would say, rattling the beer glasses the whole length of the table with a mighty blow of his fist. "Blimey, White, that's all you got to do. Just wait till we get on the other side." But all these threats were forgotten months before the time came for carrying them out. Once Tommy understood the reasonableness of severe discipline, he took his punishment for his offenses without complaint. He realized, too, the futility of kicking against the pricks. In the army he belonged to the government, body and soul. He might resent its treatment of him. He might behave like a sulky schoolboy, disobey order after order, and break rule after rule. In that case he found himself checkmated at every turn. Punishment became more and more severe. No one was at all concerned about his grievances. He might become a habitual offender from sheer stupidity. But in doing so he injured no one but himself. A few of these incorrigibles were discharged in disgrace. A few followed the lead of the Boer warrior. After many threats which we despaired of his ever carrying out, he finally "greased off." He was immediately posted as a deserter, but, to our great joy, was never captured. With the disappearance of the malcontents and incorrigibles, the battalion soon reached a high grade of efficiency. The physical incompetents were likewise ruthlessly weeded out. All of us had passed a fairly tough examination at the recruiting offices, but many had physical defects which were discovered only by the test of actual training. In the early days of the war, requirements were much more severe than later, when England learned how great would be the need for men. Many who later re-enlisted in other regiments were discharged as physically unfit for further military service. If the standard of conduct in my battalion is any criterion, then I can say truthfully that there is very little crime in Lord Kitchener's armies, either in England or abroad. The Jankers, or defaulters, squad was always rather large, but the Jankers' men were offenders against minor points in discipline. Their crimes were untidy appearance on parade, inattention in the ranks, tardiness at roll call, and others of the sort, all within the jurisdiction of a company officer. The punishment meted out varied according to the seriousness of the offense and the past conduct record of the offender. It usually consisted of from 1 to 10 days C.B., confined to barracks. During the period of his sentence, the offender was forbidden to leave camp after the parades for the day were ended, and in order that he might have no opportunity to do so, he was compelled to answer his name at the guard-room whenever it should be sounded. Only twice in England did we have a general court-martial, the offense in each case being assault by a private upon an N.C.O., and the penalty awarded 3 months in the military prison at Aldershot. Tommy was quiet and law-abiding in England, his chief lapses being due to an exaggerated estimate of his capacity for beer. In France, his conduct, in so far as my observation goes, has been splendid throughout. During 6 months in the trenches I saw but 2 instances of drunkenness, although I witnessed nearly everything which took place in my own battalion and heard the general gossip of many others. Never did I see or hear of a woman treated otherwise than courteously. Neither did I see or hear of any instances of looting or petty pilfering from the civilian inhabitants. It is true that the men had fewer opportunities for misconduct, and they were fighting in a friendly country. Even so, active service as we found it was by no means free from temptations. The admirable restraint of most of the men in the face of them was a fine thing to see. Frequent changes were made in methods of training in England, to correspond with changing conditions of modern warfare as exemplified in the trenches. Textbooks on military tactics and strategy, which were the inspired gospel of the last generation of soldiers, became obsolete overnight. Experience gained in Indian Mutiny wars or on the veldt in South Africa was of little value in the trenches or in Flanders. The emphasis shifted from open fighting to trench warfare, and the textbook which our officers studied was a typewritten serial issued semi-weekly by the War Office, and which was based on the dearly bought experience of officers at the front. We spent many a starry night on the hills above Folkestone, digging trenches and building dugouts according to General Staff instructions, and many a rainy one we came home, covered with mud, but happy in the thought that we were approximating, as nearly as could be, the experience of the boys at the front. Bomb-throwing squads were formed, and the best shots in the battalion, the men who had made marksman scores on the rifle ranges, were given daily instruction in the important business of sniping. More generous provision for the training of machine-gun teams was made, but so great was the lack in England of these important weapons that for many weeks we drilled with wooden substitutes, gaining such knowledge of machine-gunnery as we could from the study of our M.G. manuals. These new duties, coming as an addition to our other work, meant an increased period of training. We were impatient to be at the front, but we realized by this time that Lord Kitchener was serious in his demand that the men of the new armies be efficiently trained. Therefore we worked with a will, and at last, after 9 months of monotonous toil, the order came. We were to proceed on active service. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Kitchener's Mob by James Norman Hall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Kitchener's Mob by James Norman Hall. Chapter 4. Chapter 4. Ordered Abroad. One Sunday morning in May, we assembled on the barrack square at Aldershot for the last time. Every man was in full marching order. His rifle was the short Lee-Enfield Mark IV, his bayonet the long single-edged blade in general use throughout the British Army. In addition to his arms, he carried 120 rounds of .303 caliber ammunition, an entrenching tool, water bottle, haversack, containing both emergency and the day's rations, and his pack, strapped to shoulders and waist in such a way that the weight of it was equally distributed. His pack contained the following articles: a greatcoat, a woolen shirt, 2 or 3 pairs of socks, a change of underclothing, a housewife, the soldier's sewing kit, a towel, a cake of soap, and a hold-all, in which were a knife, fork, spoon, razor, shaving brush, toothbrush, and comb. All of these were useful and sometimes essential articles, particularly the toothbrush, which Tommy regarded as the best little instrument for cleaning the mechanism of a rifle ever invented. Strapped on top of the pack was the blanket roll, wrapped in a waterproof ground sheet, and hanging beneath it, the canteen in its khaki cloth cover. Each man wore an identification disc on a cord about his neck. It was stamped with his name, regimental number, regiment, and religion. A first-aid field dressing, consisting of an antiseptic gauze pad and bandage, and a small vial of iodine, sewn in the lining of his tunic, completed the equipment. Physically, the men were in the pink, as Tommy says. They were clear-eyed, vigorous, alert, and as hard as nails. With their caps on, they looked the well-trained soldiers, which they were. But with caps removed, they resembled so many uniformed convicts, less the prison pallor. Oversea haircuts were the last tonsorial cry, and for several days previous to our departure the army hairdressers had been busily wielding the close-cutting clippers. Each of us had received a copy of Lord Kitchener's letter to the troops ordered abroad, a brief, soldier-like statement of the standard of conduct which England expected her fighting men. You are ordered abroad as a soldier of the King to help our French comrades against the invasion of a common enemy. You will have to perform a task which will need your courage, your energy, your patience. Remember that the honor of the British Army depends upon your individual conduct. It will be your duty not only to set an example of discipline and perfect steadiness under fire, but also to maintain the most friendly relations with those whom you are helping in this struggle. The operation in which you are engaged will, for the most part, take place in a friendly country, and you can do your own country no better service than in showing yourself, in France and Belgium, in the true character of a British soldier. Be invariably courteous, considerate, and kind. Never do anything likely to injure or destroy property, and always look upon looting as a disgraceful act. You are sure to meet with a welcome and to be trusted, and your conduct must justify that welcome and that trust. Your duty cannot be done unless your health is sound, so keep constantly on your guard against any excesses. In this new experience you may find temptations both in wine and women. You must entirely resist both temptations, and while treating all women with perfect courtesy, you should avoid any intimacy. Do your duty bravely, fear God, honor the King. Kitchener, Field Marshal. It was an effective appeal, and a constant reminder to the men of the glorious traditions of the British Army. In the months that followed, I had opportunity to learn how deep and lasting was the impression made upon them by Lord Kitchener's first, and I believe his only, letter to his soldiers. The machinery for moving troops in England works without the slightest friction. The men, transport, horses, commissariat, medical stores, and supplies of a battalion are entrained in less than half an hour. Everything is timed to the minute. Battalion after battalion and train after train, we moved out of Aldershot at half-hour intervals. Each train arrived at the port of embarkation on scheduled time and pulled out on the docks by the side of a troop transport, great slate-colored liners, taken out of the merchant service. Not a moment was lost. The last man was aboard, and the last wagon on the crane swinging up over the ship's side as the next train came in. Ship by ship, we moved down the harbor in the twilight, the boys crowding the rail on both sides, taking their farewell look at England, home. It was the last farewell for many of them, but there was no martial music, no waving of flags, no tearful good-byes. Our farewell was as prosaic as our long period of training had been. We were each one a very small part of a tremendous business organization which works without any of the display considered so essential in the old days. We left England without a cheer. There was not so much as a wave of the hand from the wharf, for there was no one on the wharf to wave, with the exception of a few dock laborers, and they had seen too many soldiers off to the front to be sentimental about it. It was a tense moment for the men, but trust Tommy to relieve a tense situation. As we steamed away from the landing ship, we passed a barge loaded at the water's edge with coal. Tommy has a song pat to every occasion. He enjoys above all things giving a ludicrous twist to a weepy ballad. When we were within hailing distance of the coal barge, he began singing one of this variety: "Keep the home fires burning," to the smutty-faced barge hands. Every one joined in heartily, forgetting all about the solemnity of the leave-taking. Tommy is a prosaic chap. This was never more apparent to me than upon the pleasant evening in May when we said good-bye to England. The lights of home were twinkling their farewells far in the distance. Every moment brought us nearer to the great adventure. We were off to the wars, to take our places in the far-flung battle line. Here was romance lavishly offering gifts dearest to the hearts of youth, offering them to clerks, barbers, tradesmen, drapers, assistants, men who had never known an adventure more thrilling than a holiday excursion to the Isle of Man or a week of cycling in Kent. And they accepted them with all the stolidity native to Englishmen. The eyes of the world were upon them. They had become the knights-errant of every schoolgirl. They were figures of heroic proportions to everyone but themselves. French soldiers are conscious of the romantic possibilities offered them by the so-called divine accident of war. They go forth to fight for glorious France, France, the unconquerable. Tommy shoulders his rifle and departs for the four corners of the world on a bloomin' fine little holiday. A railway journey and a sea voyage in one. Blimey, not off bad, what? Perhaps he is stirred at the thought of fighting for England home and beauty. Perhaps he does thrill inwardly, remembering a sweetheart left behind. But he keeps it jolly well to himself. He has read me many of his letters home, some of them written during an engagement which will figure prominently in the history of the great World War. Well, I can't think of anything more now. Threads its way through a meager page of commonplaces about the weather, his food, and his personal health. A frugal line of cross-marks for kisses at the bottom of the page is his only concession to sentiment. There was, however, one burst of enthusiasm as we started on our journey, which struck me as being spontaneous and splendid and thoroughly English. Outside the harbor, we were met by our guardians, a fleet of destroyers, which was to give us safe convoy across the Channel. The moment we saw them, the men broke forth into prolonged cheering, and there were glad shouts of, "There they are, me lads! There's some o' the little old watchdog what's keepin' 'em bottled up. Good old Navy! That's where we got 'em, by the throat. Let's give 'em Sons of the Sea!" And they did. They sang with a spirit of exaltation which Englishmen rarely betray, and which convinced me how nearly the sea and England's position as mistress of the seas touch the Englishman's heart of hearts. Sons of the sea, all British born, sailing the ocean, laughing foes to scorn. They may build their ships, my lads, and think they know the game, but they can't beat the boys of the bulldog breed who made old England's name. It was a confession of faith. On the sea England can't be beaten. Tommy believed that with his whole soul, and on this occasion he sang with all the warmth of religious conviction. Our Channel voyage was uneventful. Each transport was guarded by 2 destroyers, one on either side, the 3 vessels keeping abreast and about 50 yards apart during the entire journey. The submarine menace was then at its height, and we were prepared for an emergency. The boats were swung for immediate launching, and all of the men were provided with life preservers. But England had been transporting troops and supplies to the firing line for so many months without accident that none of us were at all concerned about the possibility of danger. Furthermore, the men were too busy studying Tommy Atkins's French manual to think about submarines. They were putting the final polish on their accent in preparation for tomorrow's landing. "How far is this? Mademoiselle, avez de bring? What do you say for giving me a 2-penny packet of nosegay? Bonjour, monsieur. That ain't so dusty. Freddie, what? Let's try that Marseillaise again. You start it, Harry. Let Nobby. He knows the sounds better'n what I do. Nobby. We gotta learn that so we can sing it on the march. Wait till I find it in me book. All right now. Allons enfants de la patrie. Le jour de gloire is arrivé. Such bits of conversation may be of little interest, but they have the merit of being genuine. All of them were jotted down in my notebook at the times when I heard them. The following day we crowded into the typical French army troop train, 8 chevaux, 40 hommes to a car, and started on a leisurely journey to the firing line. We traveled all day at 8 or 10 miles an hour through Normandy. We passed through pleasant towns and villages lying silent in the afternoon sunshine and seemingly almost deserted, and through the open country, fragrant with the scent of apple blossoms. Now and then children waved to us from a cottage window, and in the fields old men and women and girls leaned silently on their hoes or their rakes and watched us pass. Occasionally an old reservist guarding the railway line would lift his cap and shout, "Vive l'Angleterre!" But more often he would lean on his rifle and smile, nodding his head courteously but silently to our salutations. Tommy, for all his stolid, dogged cheeriness, sensed the tragedy of France. It was a land swept bare of all its fine young manhood. There was no pleasant stir and bustle of civilian life. Those who were left went about their work silently and joylessly. When we asked of the men, we received always the same quiet, courteous reply, "À la guerre, monsieur." The boys soon learned the meaning of the phrase, "à la guerre." It became a war cry, a slogan. It was shouted back and forth from car to car and from train to train. You can imagine how eager we all were, how we strained our ears whenever the train stopped for the sound of the guns. But not until the following morning, when we reached the little village at the end of our railway journey, did we hear them, a low muttering like the sound of thunder beyond the horizon. How we cheered at the first faint sound which was to become so deafening, so terrible to us later. It was music to us then, for we were like others who had gone that way. We knew nothing of war. We thought it must be something adventurous and fine, something to make the blood leap and the heart sing. We marched through the village and down the popular line road, surprised, almost disappointed, to see the neat, well-kept houses and the pleasant level fields green with spring crops. We had expected that everything would be all in ruins. At this stage of the journey, however, We were still some 25 miles from the firing line. During all the journey from the coast we had seen on every side evidences of that wonderfully organized branch of the British military system, the Army Service Corps. From the village at which we detrained, everything was English. Long lines of motor transport lorries were parked along the sides of the roads. There were great ammunition bases, commissariat, supply depots, motor repair shops, wheelwright and blacksmith shops, where one saw none but khaki-clad soldiers engaged in all the non-combat business essential to the maintenance of large armies. There were long lines of transport wagons loaded with supplies, traveling field kitchens with chimneys smoking and kettles steaming as they bumped over the cobbled roads, water carts, Red Cross carts, motor ambulances, batteries of artillery, London omnibuses, painted slate gray, filled with troops, seemingly endless columns of infantry on foot, all moving with us along parallel roads toward the firing line. And most of these troops and supply columns belonged to my own division, one small cog in the British fighting machine. We advanced towards the war zone in easy stages. It was intensely hot, and the rough, cobbled roads greatly increased the difficulty of marching. In England we had frequently tramped from 15 to 25 miles in a day without fatigue, but the roads there were excellent, and the climate moist and cool. Upon our first day's march in France, a journey of only 9 miles, scores of men were overcome by heat, and several died. The suffering of the men was so great, in fact, that a halt was made earlier than had been planned, and we bivouacked for the night in the fields. Life with a battalion on the march proceeds with the same orderly routine as when in the barracks. Every man has his own particular employment. Within a few moments the level pasture land was converted into a busy community of 1,000 inhabitants. We made serviceable little dwellings by lacing together 2 or 3 waterproof ground sheets and erecting them on sticks or tying them to the wires of the fences. Latrines and refuse pits were dug under the supervision of the battalion medical officer. The sick were cared for and justice dispensed with the same thoroughness as in England. The day's offenders against discipline were punished with what seemed to us unusual severity. But we were now on active service, and offenses which were trivial in England were looked upon for this reason in the light of serious crimes. Daily we approached a little nearer to our goal, sleeping at night in the open fields or in the lofts of great rambling farm buildings. Most of these places had been used for soldiers' billets scores of times before. The walls were covered with the names of the men and regiments, and there were many penciled suggestions as to the best place to go for a basin of café or lait, as Tommy called it. Every roadside cottage was, in fact, Tommy's tavern. The thrifty French peasant women kept open house for soldiers. They served us with delicious coffee and thick slices of French bread for the very reasonable sum of 2 pence. They were always friendly and hospitable, and the men, in turn, treated them with courteous and kindly respect. Tommy was a great favorite with the French children. They climbed on his lap and rifled his pockets, and they delighted him by talking in his own vernacular, for they were quick to pick up English words and phrases. They sang Tipperary and Rule Britannia and God Save the King so quaintly and prettily that the men kept them at it for hours at a time. And so, during a week of stifling heat, we moved slowly forward. The sound of the guns grew in intensity from a faint rumbling to a subdued roar, until one evening, sitting in the open windows of a stable loft, we saw the far-off lightnings of bursting shells, and the French rockets soaring skyward, and we heard bursts of rifle and machine-gun fire, very faintly, like the sound of chestnuts popping in an oven. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Kitchener's Mob by James Norman Hill. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Kitchener's Mob by James Norman Hall. Chapter 5. The Peripatetic School. "We're going in tonight." The word was given out by the orderly sergeants at 4 in the afternoon. At 4:03 every one in camp had heard the news. Scores of miniature hand laundries, which were doing a thriving business down by the duck pond, immediately shut up shop. Damp and doubtfully clean ration bags, towels, and shirts, which were draped along the fences, were hastily gathered together and thrust into the capacious depths of pack sacks. Members of the battalion sporting contingent broke up their games of twopenny brag without even waiting for just one more hand. An unprecedented thing. The makers of war ballads, who were shouting choruses to the merry music of the mouth organ band, stopped in the midst of their latest composition and rushed off to get their marching order together. At 4:10 everyone, with the exception of the officers' servants, was all ready to move off. This, too, was unprecedented. Never before had we made haste more gladly or less needfully. But never before had there been such an incentive to haste. We were going into the trenches for the first time. The officers' servants, commonly called batmen, were unfortunate rankers who in moments of weakness had sold themselves into slavery for half a crown per week. The batman's duty was to make tea for his officer, clean his boots, wash his clothes, tuck him into bed at night, and make himself useful generally. The first test of a good batman, however, is his carrying capacity. In addition to his own heavy burden, he must carry various articles belonging to his officer. Enameled wash basins, rubber boots, bottles of Apollinaris water, service editions of the modern English poets and novelists, spirit lamps, packages of food, boxes of cigars and cigarettes, in fact, all of his personal luggage, which is in excess of the allotted 35 pounds which is carried on the battalion transport wagons. On this epoch-making day, even the officers' servants were punctual. When the order, "Packs on! Fall in!" was given, not a man was missing. Everyone was in harness, standing silently, expectantly in his place. "Charge magazines!" The bolts clicked open with the sound of one as we loaded our rifles with ball ammunition. 5 long, shiny cartridges were slipped down the charger guide into the magazine, and the cut-off closed. "Move off in column of route, A Company leading." We swung into the country road in the gathering twilight and turned sharply to our left at the crossroad where the signboard read, "To the firing line, for the use of military only." Coming into the trenches for the first time, when the deadlock along the Western Front had become seemingly unbreakable, we reaped the benefit of the experience of the gallant little remnant of the 1st British Expeditionary Force. After the retreat from Mons, they had dug themselves in and were holding tenaciously on, awaiting the long-heralded arrival of Kitchener's mob. As the units of the new armies arrived in France, they were sent into the trenches for 24 hours' instruction in trench warfare with a battalion of regulars. This one-day course in trench fighting is preliminary to fitting new troops into their own particular sectors along the front. The facetious subalterns called it the Peripatetic School. Months later we ourselves became members of the faculty, but on this first occasion we were marching up as the meekest of undergraduates. It was quite dark when we entered the desolate belt of country known as the fire zone. Pipes and cigarettes were put out, and talking ceased. We extended to groups of platoons in fours, at 100 paces interval, each platoon keeping in touch with the one in front by means of connecting files. We passed rows of ruined cottages, where only the scent of the roses in neglected little front gardens reminded one of the home-loving people who had lived there in happier days. Dim lights streamed through chinks and crannies in the walls. Now and then blanket coverings would be lifted from apertures that had been windows or doors, and we would see bright fires blazing in the middle of brick kitchen floors, and groups of men sitting about them, luxuriously sipping tea from steaming canteens. They were laughing and talking and singing songs in loud, boisterous voices, which contrasted strangely with our timid noiselessness. I was marching with one of the trench guides who had been sent back to pilot us to our position. I asked him if the Tommies in the houses were not in danger of being heard by the enemy. He laughed uproariously at this, whereupon one of our officers, a little second lieutenant, turned and hissed in melodramatic undertones, "Silence in the rank there! Where do you think you are?" Officers and men, we were new to the game then, and we held rather exaggerated notions as to the amount of care to be observed in moving up to the trenches. "Blimey, son," whispered our trench guide, "you might think we was only a couple of 100 yards from Fritzy's trenches. We're a good 2½ miles back here. All right to be careful after you gets closer up, but there's no use of whisperin' when you ain't even in rifle range." With lights, of course, it was a different matter altogether. Can't be too careful about giving the enemy artillery an aiming mark. This was the reason all the doors and windows of the ruined cottages were so carefully blanketed. "Let old Fritzy see a light? 'Ello,' he says, 'blokes in billets,' and over comes a 1/2 shells knockin' you all to blazes." As we came within the range of rifle fire, we again changed our formation and marched in single file along the edge of the road. The sharp crack, crack of small arms now sounded with vicious and ominous distinctness. We heard the melancholy song of the ricochets and spent bullets as they whirled in a wide arc high over our heads, and occasionally the less pleasing those speeding straight from the muzzle of a German rifle. We breathed more freely when we entered the communication trench in the center of the little thicket a mile more back of the first-line trenches. We wound in and out of what appeared in the darkness to be a hopeless labyrinth of earthworks. Cross streets and alleys led off in every direction. All along the way we had glimpses of dugouts lighted by candles, the doorways carefully concealed with blankets or pieces of old sacking. Groups of Tommies, in comfortable nooks and corners, were boiling tea or frying bacon over little stoves made of iron buckets or biscuit tins. I marveled at the skill of our trench guide, who went confidently on in the darkness, with scarcely a pause. At length, after a winding, zigzagging journey, we arrived at our trench, where we met the Gloucesters. There isn't one of us who hasn't a warm spot in his heart for the Gloucesters. They welcomed us so heartily and initiated us into all the mysteries of trench etiquette and trench tradition. We were at best but amateur Tommies. In them I recognized the lineal descendants of the line Atkins, men whose grandfathers had fought in the Crimea and whose fathers in Indian mutinies. They were the fighting sons of fighting sires, and they taught us more of life in the trenches in 24 hours than we had learned during 9 months of training in England. An infantryman of my company has a very kindly feeling towards one of them who probably saved his life before we had been in the trenches 5 minutes. Our first question was, of course, how far is it to the German lines? And in his eagerness to see, my fellow Tommy jumped up on the firing bench for a look, with his lighted cigarette in his mouth. He was pulled down into the trench just as a rifle cracked and a bullet went zing-ding from the parapet, precisely where he had been standing. Then the Gloucester gave him a friendly little lecture, which none of us afterward forgot. "And look here, son, never get up for a squint at Fritz with a fag on. He's got every sandbag along this parapet numbered, same as we got it. His snipers is a-layin' for us, same as ours is a-layin' for 'em." Then turning to the rest of us, "Now, we ain't arskin' to 'ave no burial parties, but any of you blokes wants to be the stiff, stand up where this guy lit his gas." There weren't any takers, and a moment later another bullet struck a sandbag in the same spot. "See, he spotted you. He'll keep a-poppin' away at that place for an hour, hopin' to get you lookin' over again. Let's see if we can find him. Give us that biscuit tin, Henry." Then we learned the biscuit tin finder trick for locating snipers. It's only approximate, of course, but it gives a pretty good hint at the direction from which the shots come. It doesn't work in the daytime, for a sniper is too clever to fire at it, but a biscuit tin set on the parapet at night in a badly sniped position is almost certain to be hit.
The angle from which the shots come is shown by the jagged edges of tin around the bullet holes. Then, as the Gloucester said, "Give 'em a nice little April shower out of your machine gun in that direction. You may fetch him, but if you don't, he won't bother you no more for an hour or two." We learned how orders are passed down the line from sentry to sentry, quietly, and with the speed of a man running. We learned how the sentries are posted and their duties. We saw the intricate mazes of telephone wires and the men of the signaling corps at their posts in the trenches, in communication with brigade, divisional, and Army Corps headquarters. We learned how to sleep, 5 men in a 4x6 dugout, and when there are no dugouts, how to hunch up on the firing benches with our waterproof sheets over our heads and doze with our knees for a pillow. We learned the order of precedence for troops in the communication trenches. Never forget that outgoin' troops 'as the right-of-way. They ain't 'ad no rest, and they're all slathered in mud, likely and dead beat for sleep. Comin' troops is fresh, and they stands to one side to let the others pass. We saw the listening patrols go out at night through the underground passage which leads to the far side of the barbed wire entanglements. From there they creep far out between the opposing line of trenches to keep watch upon the movements of the enemy, and to report the presence of his working parties or patrols. This is dangerous, nerve-trying work, for the men sent out upon it are exposed not only to the shots of the enemy, but the wild shots of their own comrades as well. I saw one patrol come in just before dawn. One of the men brought with him a piece of barbed wire clipped from the German entanglements 250 yards away. "Daffy, have a look at this here. 3-ply stuff what you can hardly get your nippers through, and to saw, and when I 'ad her at it, lummy if they didn't send up a rocket what bleedin' near 'it me in the 'ead. Take it to Captain Stevens, I 'eard him say. He's wantin' a bit to show to one of his artillery blokes. He's got a bet on with him that it's 3-ply wire. Now don't forget, Bobby, touch him for a couple of packets of fags." I was tremendously interested. At that time it seemed incredible to me that men crawled over to the German lines in this manner, and clipped pieces of German wire for souvenirs. "Did you hear anything?" I asked him. "'Eard a flute some Fritzie was a-playin' of, and you ought to 'ave 'eard 'em singin', doleful as 'ell." Several men were killed and wounded during the night. One of them was a sentry with whom I had been talking only a few moments before. He was standing on the firing bench, looking out into the darkness, when he fell back into the trench without a cry. It was a terrible wound. I would not have believed that a bullet could so horribly disfigure one. He was given first aid by the light of a candle, but it was useless. Silently his comrades removed his identification disc and wrapped him in a blanket. "Poor old Walt," they said. An hour later he was buried in a shell hole at the back of the trench. One thing we learned during our first night in the trenches was of the very first importance, and that was respect for our enemies. We came from England full of absurd newspaper tales about the German soldier's inferiority as a fighting man. We had read that he was a wretched marksman. He would not stand up to the bayonet. Whenever opportunity offered, he crept over and gave himself up. He was poorly fed and clothed, and was so weary of the war that his officers had to drive him to fight at the muzzles of the revolvers. We thought him almost beneath contempt. We were convinced in a night that we had greatly underestimated his abilities as a marksman. As for his all-around inferiority as a fighting man, one of the Gloucesters put it rather well. "'Ere, if the Germans is so bloomin' rotten, 'ow is it that we ain't a-fightin' somewheres along the Rhine, or in Austria-Hungary? No, they ain't a-firin' wild, I give you my word. Not around this part of France they ain't. What do you say, Jerry?" Jerry made a most illuminating contribution to the discussion of Fritz as a fighting man. "I'll tell you what, if ever I gets through this 'ere war, if I 'as the luck to go 'ome again with me eyesight, I'll never feel safe when I sees a Fritzie, unless I'm a-lookin' at 'im through my periscope from behind a bit of cover." How am I to give a really vivid picture of trench life as I saw it for the first time? How make it live for others, when I remember that the many descriptive accounts I had read of it in England did not in the least visualize it for me? I watched the rockets rising from the German lines, watched them burst into points of light over the devastated strip of country called No Man's Land, and drift slowly down, and I watched the charitable shadows rush back like the very wind of darkness. The desolate landscape emerged from the gloom and receded again, like a series of pictures thrown upon a screen. All of this was so new, so terrible, I doubted its reality. Indeed, I doubted my own identity, as one does at times when brought face to face with some experiences which cannot be compared with past experiences or even measured by them. I groped darkly for some new truth which was flickering just beyond the border of consciousness, but I was so blinded by the glamour of the adventure that it did not come to me then. Later, I understood. It was my first glimmering realization of the tremendous sadness, the awful futility of war.
End of chapter 5.